One more time. Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed.
And Easter was glorious, wasn't it?
Yes.
And I want to say thank you to all who helped make it possible. What an incredible day. And thanks be to God for the blessed Easter that we had out at the property of the little White House. But Easter was not only glorious, Easter is still glorious because we are an Easter people. We said last week we are fools for Christ. Last week we heard about the folly of the cross, which is God's wisdom. And in the folly of the cross, we see the death of Jesus. And because of the death and the powerful resurrection of Jesus, we know that we are forgiven. We are freed from our sin. We are then available for fellowship, to be put back together in our relationship with our loving Father and with one another. We are forgiven, we are freed, and we are ready for relationship, for fellowship with God. But that was last week. Today I want to talk about being fat Christians. I was with some folks from Grace yesterday, and it just so happened that we had lunch together, and we had barbecue, and somebody said something about I'll see you tomorrow, and I hear we're going to talk about fat Christians. I said, well, I'm just trying to practice what I will preach by eating barbecue for lunch yesterday. I had some other people say this morning, do you need any examples for your sermon this morning? But we're not going to talk about fat Christians. We're going to talk about F.A.T. Christians. I have spoken about Billy Graham's death and about what a profound impact it's had upon me. And I think upon all of Christendom, really upon the world. Billy Graham was the father of our faith. He was our patriarch. But now that he's gone, there's been a passing of the baton, a reinvigoration of the life of faith in the church, that it's not up to Billy Graham anymore to preach crusades and to bring people to Christ. It's now up to us. The baton has been passed. It's our mantle. I was talking with a pastor recently about Billy Graham's funeral and about how powerful it was that it was really a crusade of sorts, but with a much more personal flair. The gospel was preached in such a bold and beautiful way, primarily by Billy Graham's children, and grace was so evident and present in those children. You may remember Franklin Graham, who was the Hellraiser. There's stories of Franklin growing up in Montreat, North Carolina, and how he used to ride his motorcycle all through the streets of that quiet little Christian retreat town late at night and intoxicated. But Franklin Graham, by God's grace, has now become the one who has taken over the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association and now has a ministry of his own, Samaritan's Purse. At the funeral, daughter Gigi spoke so eloquently about her parents' devotion to one another and God's plan to bring them together, and shared the gospel. Probably the most gifted preacher of the Graham children. And then there was Ned. Ned, the brother, not maybe quite as well known, who battled drugs earlier in his life, but who stood up and said about his father, he was fat. He was a fat Christian. Faithful, available, and teachable. And then Ned implored all of us that we should be the same, fat. Faithful, available, and teachable. And by God's grace, I believe that we can be all three. Let's look quickly at the second lesson that we heard from the Gospel of John that depicted Jesus' second appearance to his disciples and his first appearance to Thomas, the twin, that we know as the doubter. You know, Thomas has taken a hard rap a lot of times because of his doubt, because he was not there, because he said, unless I see the nail prints in his hand and put my finger in his side, I'm not going to believe. But you know, I believe that Thomas was doing the best that he could. And why he was not present with the other disciples in the house where Jesus appeared after his resurrection, I don't know. We do not know, and Scripture does not tell us why he was not there. He may have been attending to some family business. He may have been engaged in some other important activity. But the fact of the matter, he was not there. He missed it. And he became doubtful. He felt left out. He got a little maybe bitter or uppity and said, I'm not going to believe unless I see and touch. But it was by God's grace that Thomas stuck around. He didn't let not being there push him out or get lost in a sense. He himself stayed engaged with the disciples, and maybe they also pulled him in and said, Thomas, stick with us. It's real. Maybe they reaffirmed and encouraged him. But by God's grace, as Scripture said, it was 8 days later that Jesus appeared to the disciples and to Thomas, who kept showing up, who kept hanging out. He may not have been as faithful, but he remained available. Despite his questions, despite his doubts, he remained available. And when Jesus appeared the second time, he stood among his disciples and he spoke directly to Thomas, and he said, Thomas, come here. Come here, Thomas. Put your hands in my hands. Put your finger in my side. We don't know if Thomas actually did do those things, but what we do know that Thomas did was exclaim upon seeing the risen Lord and my God. The most complete statement of who Jesus is was saved for Thomas himself, the doubter, who claimed that Jesus was not only his Lord, but his God. It's only Thomas that makes that bold proclamation and believed. And Jesus said to Thomas, blessed are you because you have seen, but is that the only reason that you believe? Because you've seen. And then Jesus goes and speaks a word to all of those who would not be in that room that day. And that's you and that's me. But blessed are those who have not seen me physically, touched me, and yet believe. You know, the fact of the matter is we're not those who have the opportunity to place our hands in Jesus' hands, to put our finger in Jesus' wound, to encounter the risen Christ in that way. But still we are blessed with the opportunity to believe, to have faith, to be faithful, because there are still experiences of grace that come to us as we remain faithful by God's grace, available by God's grace, and are teachable by experiences of grace. Thomas did that, and he experienced grace, and he learned, and he grew because of the grace of the risen Lord that pulled him in. I believe that it is only by experiences of grace that we learn and grow in grace. It's one thing to hear about grace. It's another thing to try to understand grace. But as Thomas experienced grace and was taught by that experience, it transformed him and he was changed forever. I believe the same is true for us. Now, change gears with me here. I want to look quickly at the parable that Ida read. The parable of the two sons, or the lost son. Two profiles of the sons to look at briefly, to help us see a clearer picture maybe of ourselves and a clearer picture of God, our Father. First, the younger son. The younger son was not very fat, at least in the way that he practiced faithfulness. He had faithlessness. He decided to go his own way, to not have faith in his father, to say, "You are dead to me. Give me the inheritance that is mine before you die, and I'll go and do my own thing." And that's exactly what he did. He took his own path to live his own life. He was unavailable. He was lost in that life. It went sour. Even the friends that he had because of his wealth and generosity, when it was gone, they left him. And there he found himself in the pit of hell, so to speak. The only way that he could feed himself or to try to get by was to feed pigs, the lowest occupation that he could have adopted. And it was there in that lowest place, rock bottom, if you will, that he finally became available to God's activity in his life. And sometimes it is true for us and true for people that we know who have become faithless, become selfish, and become unavailable, that it's only when the rock bottom is hit, only when they're flat on their back and able only to look up, that they become available to see a different way in life. You may have experienced that yourself or know others who have. But there's the first and younger son. And he comes to his senses, the scripture says. He comes to himself. What am I doing here? How foolish I have been. My father's servants have it better than I do. At least I could go back and get a job on the farm. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back and say to my father, "I have sinned against you." He recognized his sinfulness, his faithlessness, his selfishness. "I've sinned against you, Father. I'm not worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. At least do that, Father." And so he makes his way home. And when he gets to the foot of the driveway, he looks up at the house, and there's the father. As the father sees his son a long distance off, the father hikes up his robes. In a gesture of disgrace for a grown man in that culture, because grown men did not run, they walked everywhere they went. And grown men did not show their legs, but the father hiked up his robe to show his legs and to disgrace himself and run to his son, who was lost but had become found, who was dead but was now alive. And when the father gets to the son, he throws himself onto his neck, showering him with kisses, and the son starts his speech that he had rehearsed, and he says, "Father, I have sinned against you." He confesses. "I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. I've lost standing with you." But before he can get to the next line, "Treat me as one of your hired servants," the father stops him and says, "Bring the robe and wrap it around him. Put the ring on his finger and the sandals on his feet. Treat him as the son that he is, that he has always been. And kill the choice calf, and let's have a party and celebrate. For my son has come home." What an experience of grace that became the teachable moment for the younger son. His life was transformed by the experience of grace. On the other hand, we have the older son, who was faithful. He was fat. He was faithful in that way. He stayed on the farm. He was obedient. He was loyal. He did everything exactly as his father would want him to do, or so he thought. And the older son not only seems to be faithful, he seems to be available, but maybe he was not. For when the moment of his younger brother coming home, where was he? He was not at home. He was still out in the field, still out trying to earn his Father's favor. He was not available to grace because he was out still trying to earn it in the field, to prove himself, to work harder than anybody else, and to show his Father how much he deserved his love. He almost misses it. A servant has to be sent out to find him. What's going on, the older brother asks, unavailable to the happening in the family. And when he finds out that his younger brother has come home and the father has showered him with grace, he becomes angry and he is blocked by it because it doesn't meet with his expectations. So the father goes out to appeal to the son. And he says, look what you've done to this no good scoundrel who lost everything. And he comes back and you do this for him. And the father says, son, what is mine has always been yours. The grace has always been here for you. All of it has been yours. It always has been, and it always will be. The grace is available for you. You don't have to earn it, my son. It is yours. Come on, join the party. Come on, be part of what is happening here and the joy of it. For your brother that was dead is now alive, who was lost is now found. The older brother was seeking to be faithful but was unavailable and thereby not teachable. But to be taught, grace has to be experienced. And grace is experienced through surrender. As Thomas surrendered to the risen Lord, as the younger son surrendered to the grace of the Father, and the older brother struggled to die to himself. We hear the words of the Apostle Paul, who experienced grace, who was taught by the extraordinary event of being knocked off his donkey on the road to Damascus by God's grace. And his life was turned around. He was taught about whom this God he was seeking to persecute. When the Lord said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? But it's this same Saul who became Paul, the apostle, who wrote in Galatians, the 2nd chapter, the 20th verse, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. And my friends, if we have been crucified with Christ, we have also been raised with him. So how then shall we live as Easter people? By faith. Because without faith it is impossible to please God. And we are saved by grace, Scripture tells us, through faith, which is a gift, so that none of us can boast about this faith that we have been given. And faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It is the conviction of things not seen. And so we, as followers of the risen Christ, are able to be faithful by stepping out in faith and trusting the Lord with all our hearts, not leaning on our own understanding, but acknowledging him in all of our ways, knowing that he will make our paths straight. And that is being available. That is being available as we live a life of faith. To say, as Samuel said, Lord, I seek to be faithful. Speak, your servant is listening. To be available like Isaiah, who said, I am a man of unclean lips. But after his experience of grace in the temple said, here I am. Send me. He was available. And so we too can be faithful and available that we might be teachable And not just to be taught by grace, but to experience grace and to be transformed by it and never be the same. In Billy Graham's funeral, there was one more of the siblings who spoke. And it was the daughter of Billy Graham, Ruth. And in her testimony, she shared how after 20 years of marriage, she went through a painful divorce. And then she quickly fell in love with another man. And it was much too soon, she said. And against the advice of her parents, she married the man anyway. And then she stated that she knew it was a mistake within days of the marriage. And so she ran away, or she fled, is the word that she used. And so she drove home to Montreat, and the drive took her 2 days to get back to her parents' home. And when she arrived, she said she expected her parents to scold her and say, "We told you so, and how could you embarrass us this way?" But she continued by saying, "You know, no one wants to be the one who embarrasses Billy Graham, by the way." But as she drove into the driveway, she looked up, and there was her father. And he was standing there waiting for her. And she got out of the car, and Billy Graham came to her and hugged her and simply said to her, "Welcome home." Ruth finished up her talk, and she took her seat. And it was clear to all that they had seen in Billy Graham not just a man who understood grace, not just a man who experienced grace, but because of that was the picture of a man who shared grace. My friends, the table is grace. And Jesus Christ is the host of this table. And he has prepared it, and he serves this meal, and he invites all to come to it who wish to be, by grace, faithful, available, teachable, and used to share grace. And so the table is ready, and Jesus is waiting, and he is saying, "Welcome home." Won't you come? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.